Like much of the nation, I've been in lockdown for the last 2 months, hence the state of my hair at the moment. I've spent a lot of that time lying in bed, refreshing news feeds, and squirting ketchup directly into my mouth. But I've also been watching the science fiction horror film Alien a lot. It's really good. So I love how the filmmakers use lighting to pace the film. So there's this sequence in the film where the character's ship crashes on this planet, and the lighting becomes increasingly erratic. It can almost be difficult to watch, but it helps inject energy into a sequence that is deliberately slow in order to build tension. Alien represents a group of filmmakers on the top of their game, making something truly special in the process. I've seen some critics describe Alien as timeless, and that seems weird to me. Timeless is kind of a magical notion. It implies that something could have been made in any historical moment, but to me, Alien is deeply rooted in the anxieties surrounding political changes that were occurring in the 1970s. So instead, if Alien is still popular with audiences today, it is not because the film is timeless, but because it's relevant. It's relevant because those anxieties are still at work today. I want to suggest that Alien was a response to various changes that were happening to capitalist governments during the 1970s. These changes are known as the neoliberal turn. We will be going into more detail on this in part 1, but it is worth knowing at this point that the 1970s saw a number of changes that significantly increased corporate power over the political and domestic sphere. By placing Alien in its historical context, I hope to show to you how Alien both imagined this increased corporate power and also how Alien positions itself as an anti-capitalist film. So this video explores both how Alien understands the modes of capitalism that were contemporary to it, and how it imagines a resistance to the corporatization of the political system might form. I think this is exciting because we get to see how a group of artists were imagining resistance to the neoliberal turn contemporaneously to its implementation. I'm going to be focusing on this transition to neoliberalism in the context of the UK and USA, as these are the countries the directors and writers of Alien were from. I isolate 3 anxieties about the neoliberal turn that appear in the film that demonstrate how Alien imagined the neoliberal future and how it might be resisted. So that is what you're in for. There's going to be desperate workers, corporate overlords, sketchy surveillance, and at one point I talk about an ejaculating womb, so that should be fun. But wait, I hear you say. Alien's got nothing to do with capitalism. It's about some scary ass monster from the depths of space. What's that got to do with capitalism? So let's get that point dealt with quickly, and we can do that quite easily with a plot synopsis, which, conveniently, means anyone who hasn't seen the film is going to be on the same page as everyone else. Fucking A. Alien follows a crew of workers aboard a commercial tug ship called the Nostromo, which is transporting mineral ore. Essentially truck drivers in space, the crew of the Nostromo work for the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, who also own the ship. At the beginning of the film, the crew are awoken by the ship's computer, Mother, and sit down to eat, as the 2 lowest paid members of the group, Brett and Parker, discuss the unfair distribution of payment among the crew.
Mr. Parker and I feel that the bonus situation has never been on an equitable level.
Well, you get what you contracted for like everybody else.
Yes, but everybody else gets more than us.
It is then revealed that Mother has awoken the crew after picking up a transmission of unknown origin. Brett and Parker resist investigating, but it turns out they are contractually obliged to investigate the signal, even though it goes beyond their contracted duties, and if they don't do it, they risk having their pay cut. From here, we get the first anxiety of the film, the power the Weyland-Yutani Company have over the workers. The crew head down to the planet, where they find the wreck of an extraterrestrial spaceship. Inside, one of the crew members, named Kane, discovers a strange fleshy egg from which a crab-like creature called a facehugger emerges and violently attaches itself to Kane's face. The crew rush him back to the ship, where a tension emerges between the chief science officer, Ash, and the warrant officer, Ripley. Ripley scolds Ash for breaking the quarantine procedure by letting Kane in, and Ripley and Ash enter into a power struggle over how they should proceed. Considering Alien is quite famous for not a lot happening before the midpoint, a lot happens before the midpoint. This is put aside when the facehugger suddenly detaches itself from Kane's face and Kane appears to be fine. The crew sits down for a meal when Kane starts to violently convulse and an alien life form bursts from Kane's chest. The creature is known as a xenomorph, and it rapidly grows and starts killing off the crew members one by one. Throughout the film, we see the xenomorph in glimpses. It seems to be alive, but also almost inorganic. It blends into the metal of the Nostromos like a machine. It is then discovered that the xenomorph is not the only being that plays with the boundaries between organic and inorganic. It turns out that Ash is in fact a synthetic life form planted on the ship to spy for the company. His mission is to ensure the safe passage of the xenomorph into the company's hands, and it is implied that, on company orders, he has manipulated the crew to get the xenomorph on board the ship.
There is an explanation for this, you know.
From here, a second anxiety emerges about the relationship between technology and corporate control. It turns out the company wants to capture and study the xenomorph.
They must have wanted the alien for the weapons division.
Upon this discovery, Ripley, who has been a stickler for following company procedure,
You know the quarantine procedure.
24 hours for decontamination.
turns her back on the company and decides the only course of survival is to blow up the company-owned ship with the xenomorph on it and escape on an emergency shuttle. Reduced to the only survivor, Ripley faces off against the xenomorph and, after a long battle,
I blew it out of the goddamn airlock.
victorious, she makes one last report as the credits roll. So we've discussed two of the anxieties. The first two anxieties concern the influence corporate entities have over workers, but I said there are three anxieties. The third anxiety is different. Kane's death is the result of the xenomorph erupting from his chest in this kind of birthing scene. Some critics have therefore concluded that Alien is about anxiety surrounding the feminization of men. But I think that's quite a reductive reading of Alien. I actually think Alien has far more radical ideas of sex that it links to anti-corporate activities. This idea of sex is far weirder than traditional readings take it to be. Part 1. Corporate Control. First thesis. Alien demonstrates an anxiety concerning corporate power over workers. Now, I alluded to this a little bit in the introduction, and in this part we're going to go into more detail about things like the role of Parker and Brett in the film and Ash's role as a corporate spy. But anxieties like this, they don't emerge from a vacuum, so let's have a look at what was happening in the political landscape from which Alien emerged. Following the Second World War, capitalism was organised around a form of economics known as Keynesianism. Keynesian economics can be understood as something of a compromise between employers and workers, although it leaned heavily in favour of employers. It allowed workers to become more involved in the decision-making processes of capitalism in the form of unions, so long as these unions did not rock the boat too much and threaten the capitalist pursuit of profit. Therefore, under Keynesianism, workers had a small degree of control over their work environments. Additionally, they had a safety net in the form of state welfare that would provide basic necessities to all workers so that, if they lost their job, they would have the means to ensure their survival. This would change in 1979 with the election of Prime Minister Thatcher the Milk Snatcher in the UK, and President Ronald Reagan in America in 1980. The Thatcher and Reagan administrations were both influenced by the neoliberal schools of thought that had begun with the Chicago School in the 1930s and gained significant ideological and material ground in the 1970s during the series of economic downturns that defined that decade. The neoliberal project aimed to minimise state intervention in the welfare of its citizens and the running of businesses, and instead shift the state's focus towards dismantling trade union power and granting sweeping powers to business owners. What is important for our purposes is that the neoliberal turn meant that the welfare state that secured basic necessities of survival for the workers was disintegrated and granted to private business in the form of private ownership of utilities like electricity and public transport, thereby putting the workers at the mercy of corporate interests. The legal ground upon which neoliberalism was built was observable being implemented into state law during the 1970s. For instance, during this time, the US Supreme Court handed down several rulings that granted corporate interests significant powers. Two such rulings include Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976 and the First National Bank of Boston v. Belletti in 1978. Two of many rulings that stated that limits on corporate expenditure during election campaigns were unconstitutional, which effectively meant corporations could now just buy elections. At the same time, the role of the state was shifting. Whereas previously the role of the state had been to ensure a healthy pool of workers existed for corporations and capitalists to employ, now their concerns were shifted to elsewhere, such as dismantling trade union power. This meant that the workers were now at the direct mercy of the corporations and business owners who employed them, meaning the workers' efforts could all be directed to securing profit. This micromanaging of the lives of workers is seen throughout Alien, from the company-owned computer determining when the workers should wake up, to the layers of procedure that Ripley constantly refers to.
Since when is that standard procedure?
Standard procedure is to do what the hell they tell you to do.
Ostensibly, the company set up these procedures for the protection of the crew. Ripley explicitly mentions that letting Kane onto the ship would break the quarantine procedures that the company set up and endanger the entire crew.
Unfortunately, by breaking quarantine, you risk everybody's life.
Having seen the film, we know that Ash is in fact a company spy, and his goal is to transport the xenomorph to the company. While the film is unclear if the Weyland-Yutani company already knew about the xenomorph or it was a coincidence, we do know they had procedures set up in case such an eventuality occurred. It hardly matters next to the fact that they deliberately broke with the procedures they set up ostensibly to protect their workers when the opportunity emerges to acquire the xenomorph as an asset. The safety and security of workers is a secondary concern for capitalism, ranked far below that of securing profit. Securing profit is the means by which capitalist organisations survive, and they will do anything to stay profitable, including firing workers, docking their pay, or subjecting them to dangerous situations if it means they will remain profitable or they will be able to acquire an asset that may lead to further profits. Just look at the contemporary response to COVID for an example. In the context of Alien, this disregard for worker safety is what leads to the xenomorph getting on board in the first place and everyone on the ship dying bar Ripley. Alien understands capitalism as ruthless and detrimental to the working class. The capitalist perspective is given voice in Ash's description of the xenomorph, which might as well be a description of capitalism itself.
Perfect organism. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility.
You admire it.
I admire its purity, survival, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality.
What Ash admires in the xenomorph is its relentless pursuit of its goal to survive. Survival for the xenomorph means the destruction and consumption of the workers aboard the Nostromos. Ash describes the xenomorph like a machine or a system designed to its single purpose without consideration of anything beyond that. As Ash is a representative of the company, we could read it as a description of what the company seeks to be. A great machine built to extract profit from its workers in order to survive the capitalistic marketplace. This goal, its highest goal, renders all other concerns secondary, including the survival of the company's workers. One of the means of survival for neoliberalism and capitalism more broadly has been the sabotaging of worker solidarity. Beyond using the state to violently put down strikes, a core aspect of neoliberal worker organisation has been the deferring of management of the workspace to a member of the workers themselves, who then has to represent the company. This is shown in Alien through Captain Dallas. The captain is the only character who can interact with the company through Mother, the ship's computer. This means that when Parker and Brett want to discuss the unfair distribution of pay on the ship, they have no way to interact with and challenge the company themselves. With access to the company cut off for the lowest paid workers, this makes it increasingly difficult for them to organise in response to the unfair treatment the company subjects them to. And indeed, I have set up this analysis as a two-sided conflict between the company and the workers, but the workers themselves are stratified as a group. Consider the fact that Parker, the only non-white character in the film and an African American man, is among the two lowest paid members of the crew. This reflects the American and European exploitation and oppression of black people, from the Atlantic slave trade to the higher incarceration of black people to the deluge of police violence that continues to this day and has erupted into the Minneapolis uprising that is going on right now as I record this. Capitalism has its foundations in the transatlantic slave trade, which enslaved black people from the continent of Africa, transported them to the Americas where they were forced to work in grueling conditions for no pay, and fed these profits to Europe and later the United States, among other countries. Additionally, these settler colonialists seized Native American lands and expelled and systematically murdered whole populations of Native American people. At the foundation of capitalism, therefore, is this double system of slavery and genocide, without which the USA and Europe would not have risen to the position of economic power they did. This continued well after slavery was officially abolished, with, for instance, Britain gaining significant wealth through engagement with the slave trade. Additionally, the subjugation of black and indigenous peoples continued well after the official abolition of slavery. Earlier in this video, I stated that Keynesian economics provided a safety blanket for the workers. Truthfully, this was only for certain workers, as people of colour were often deliberately left out. In the UK, the state used its powers to systematically disenfranchise Afro-Caribbean immigrants, as well as revoking citizenship for many Commonwealth citizens who were deemed not British enough. This is just one of the many examples of racist policies in the UK that have only intensified in the last 2 decades under neoliberalism. The horrifying revelations about the British government's treatment of the Windrush generation and the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, whose occupants were mainly people of colour, have brought the racism of the British state into stark relief. Even so, very little has been done to support these victims, and the current Conservative government is only increasing its racist policies. In the USA, the Jim Crow laws meant that black and indigenous peoples were unable to access many of the benefits granted to white workers. Even after the abolition of the Jim Crow laws, practices such as gerrymandering have ensured the continuation of the subjugation of black and indigenous populations in America. In both the US and the UK, wage disparity between white and black workers is staggering. The disenfranchisement of black people under capitalism has a long and brutal history, and Alien does not see this changing in the future. We must understand Alien's conception of the working class as one that is hierarchized by race and corporate interests. While the company does ultimately decide that the entire crew is expendable, it does so in a context in which certain members of the crew are given less pay, less say, and exploited more heavily. Parker does not have the opportunity to determine what happens next, with the captain often telling him to behave. When he points out the unfair pay situation he is in, he is ignored and told this is just company policy. Even in this context of life or death, Parker has no agency in the situation. Alien looks at a specific manifestation of racism as it takes place under neoliberalism. It takes a specific form in which responsibility is transferred from the company to a white member of the crew who themselves have very little agency. However, this does not let the captain off the hook. He may have a little power, but he still chooses to represent the company, and he does so with little complaint and never goes against their line.
Parker, will you just listen to the man?
It seems therefore that survival in Alien is not just figured as a fight against the xenomorph, but also the corporate structures that render the crew unequal and actively undermine the character's ability to survive. It is as if the filmmakers saw the danger of the increasing corporate power over the lives of the workers and their pursuit of life. When we watch Alien, we are not watching something timeless, but rather something specific to the neoliberal era. We are watching the powers of neoliberalism working upon the characters in the fight to survive. The deeper we go into Alien, the more we can see of this tension between the company and the workers, and the more we analyse Alien, the more we can see how the filmmakers envisioned corporate power and its effects on workers. But we haven't really discussed how they envisioned the operation of this power, how it works, how it maintains itself. This I turn to in Part 2. Technology and Power. Alien presents a model of power in which the worker is constantly surrounded by the power of a corporate gaze. This corporate gaze constantly monitors the worker and sets the limits of what they can do. In 1975, Michel Foucault published Discipline and Punish. In it, he argued that, since the 18th century, society has been modelled after a particular kind of prison. This prison is called a panopticon. While the panopticon does have real-world historical examples, it is important to understand that this model is kind of a metaphor rather than something literal. The panopticon is made up of a series of cells arranged in a circular pattern around a tower. A guard is placed in the central tower and can see into each cell, thanks to the 360-degree view granted by the tower. However, the guard's visual domination over the space is not available to the prisoners in the cells. The panopticon is structured in such a way that the cell is well lit, so the guard can see into each cell, while the tower itself remains dark, visually inaccessible to the prisoners. Consequently, the prisoner never knows if they are being watched or not. The guard could be looking at them at any time, and the prisoner wouldn't know it, so the prisoner is always afraid that if they did step out of line, the guard would see and punish them for it. This means that the authority of the guard's gaze is always exerted upon the prisoner, ensuring that the prisoner behaves in the way desired by the prison system. Effectively, this disciplines the prisoner into the desired behaviour. This description of a central hub surrounded by a circular structure can be found in Alien in the design of Mother, the ship's computer that controls the Nostromo's various technical functions and the crew's point of contact with the company. This immediately aligns the computer and the panopticon as an extension of the company's power, but you might notice something weird. While the structure recalls the panopticon in that a central hub is surrounded by a circular structure, the hub is occupied by one of the crew members, while the digital representation of the company takes the position of the cells in the form of a series of computer monitors. Does this imply the crew member is now empowered? I think not. After all, it is the crew members the company condemns to death. The company controls when the crew members wake up, and it is the company that sends the characters down to the alien planet. We might call the structure a reverse panopticon. We can understand the structure as placing the worker in the absolute centre of corporate power's gaze. Power is no longer situated in the rigid central position of the guard tower as it was in Foucault's panopticon, but dispersed across space. The worker is constantly monitored, and the space around them carefully constructed to organise and contain them. The gaze in the reverse panopticon is also digitised, taking the form of digital technology. In Alien, this is shown for all the monitors that line the walls of the room. This, of course, has parallels to the real world. For instance, in the 1980s, the use of digital technology to monitor workers was becoming controversial, particularly after the publishing of the paper The Electronic Supervisor, New Technology, New Tensions in 1987. This paper stated that such technologies were used for union busting, among other things. This practice of digitized monitoring of workers has only intensified in the modern day. At Deloitte and the Bank of America, employees are required to carry a tracking card that monitors everything they do, where they go, who they speak to, and even the tone of their speech. In 2018, Amazon patented a wristband that will operate similarly, intensifying the already horrifying working conditions of their factories. The reverse panopticon employed in Alien speaks to the increased digitization of worker surveillance and control that would come to define the neoliberal era. We can recognize an anxiety in the film concerning these digital technologies of control and their effects on the bodies of the characters. The theme is introduced early in this shot. In it, digital text is reflected on the helmets of some of the crew members. The helmets represent the absence of the human onto which digital text can be mapped. There is this constant anxiety in the film concerning this intermingling of the human and the technological. This is rendered vividly when the characters are awoken from their slumber in the sleep pods by the computer. They become like machines that can be turned on at the press of a button. Indeed, there is a concern in Alien about the intermingling of the organic and inorganic, most clearly demonstrated through the derelict ship and the xenomorph itself. These designs, the work of Swiss artist H.R. Geiger, bring the biological and mechanical into nightmarish biomechanical union. The xenomorph drips with viscous fluids, thick saliva, and responds to the world with the unpredictability of a predator in the wild. Yet, it is marked by tubes and skin that seems more like rubber than anything human. It is like a human body pushed beyond anything recognisably human, cold and calculating as a computer, but ruthless in its hunt for prey. Similarly, when the characters first enter the derelict ship, they move through claustrophobic corridors that seem almost capillary-like. This gives way to large open chambers that seem like great organs marked by undulating walls that remind one of the skin of some beast. It is like walking through the innards of some great creature, impossibly old, without vitality, yet preserved through its inorganicity. Indeed, the walls of the derelict ship seem to sweat, as if this beast somehow clings to life, undead and dormant, waiting to awaken. This intermingling of the organic and inorganic is not limited to the derelict ship either. The Nostromo seems to sweat too, suggesting there too lies this mixture, this monstrous other that lies in wait. And of course, there's one mixture we haven't talked about yet, and this is where things are gonna get weird.
Show me your teeth.
Part 3. At the Limits of Sex. Third thesis. Alien is a film about what Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari call becoming, with apologies to all French language speakers in the audience for my pronunciation of their names. In their 1987 text, 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guttari dedicated a chapter to an idea they called becoming. Becoming refers to a process in which two entities come into contact with each other and, through this contact, undergo a process of change that undoes the presupposed unity of each entity. Deleuze and Guattari use the example of a wasp pollinating an orchid to render this idea in more concrete terms. Orchids trick wasps into landing on them by making it appear that a viable mate for the wasp is on the orchid. The wasp lands on the orchid, and the orchid's pollen sticks to the wasp, so that the next orchid the wasp lands on will be pollinated. In this way, the wasp turns into a sexual organ in an assemblage that includes both the wasp and the orchid. Deleuze and Guattari resist the notion that this is simply a case of the orchid imitating the wasp. Instead, they argue it is not imitation at all, but a capture of code, an increase in valence, a veritable becoming, a becoming wasp of the orchid and a becoming orchid of the wasp. By this, Deleuze and Guattari are referring to the fundamental transformation the orchid and the wasp undergo through their contact with one another. It is this contact that undoes the orchid and the wasp as distinct beings and lends the possibility for transformation of both. This transformation introduces new possibilities for that which is becoming. It enables them to transcend the bounds in which they were previously kept. This sense of becoming is at work in Alien throughout the first half of the film in the relationship between Kane and the facehugger he encounters on the derelict ship. The opening of the film serves to underline Kane's body. The film lingers on his body for several seconds as he awakens from hypersleep. There are shots of Kane's body frozen in an upright position, his eyes heavy with sleep. These shots are connected with long fades that create a dreamlike atmosphere, signifying a body transitioning from sleep to consciousness. Indeed, the bodily elements of this transition are emphasized through the contrast of his flesh against the white background, that mark the physicality of the real world as compared to the softness of sleep. These shots set up the physicality of Kane's body, its limits that will be violated by the midpoint of the film.
I'm eating this. What's the matter? The food ain't that bad, baby.
These limits will be transcended through what Deleuze and Guattari would call a becoming facehugger, a term I will now use without ever laughing, even though it is an utterly ridiculous term. When the facehugger attaches itself to Kane, it implants an embryo inside him that will burst from his chest at the midpoint of the film. Neither Kane nor the facehugger transform into one another, but rather undergo a process of becoming through their encounter. Kane's chest becomes the avenue through which the xenomorph emerges. Kane's chest is transformed from something that protects his internal organs to something from which a life can emerge. His becoming facehugger transforms him into something that transcends the boundaries his body was previously held in. We can also read the facehugger as undergoing something we might call a becoming human. It shifts from its crab-like formation into a sexual organ that attaches itself to Cain's face. Then, it implants an embryo into Cain that itself will take on much of the appearance of Cain. In this sense, it captures the code of Cain and implements it into the organism that will become the xenomorph. We see it emerge in the xenomorph through its perverse human anatomy. Cain's becoming facehugger leads to his death. Deleuze and Guattari write that becoming can be a self-destructive force. No one can know where a becoming will lead beforehand. In the case of Cain, we see a transformation of his chest from a protective barrier to a birthing canal. It is this transcendence of the function of his chest that ultimately kills him. But wait, what happens when we read this transformation as Cain's chest becoming a birthing canal? We might then be tempted to say, okay, then Alien is about the male body and the violation of its sexual norms. But that only works if we presuppose what the male body is and what the sexual norms that govern it are. We might be able to read this differently, and that leads me to Thesis 4. Alien is about the breakdown of sexual norms as a weapon of anti-capitalist survival. Capitalism has a very complicated relationship to the idea of sexual difference, with sexual difference referring to the false idea that there are only two sexes. By claiming that women were frail or weak, capitalism could justify imprisoning them in domestic servitude or paying them less for their labour. This went hand in hand with systems of punishment that were set up to subjugate women who disproved this idea, such as the witch hunts in the early modern period, and the welfare cuts that disproportionately affected women under the Thatcher regime and austerity. However, capitalism in the past has been happy to shift these roles if it means making more money, although usually in such a way that women still remain a subject of oppression. Working class women, for instance, were often hired in factories in the 19th century, as the factory owners had decided they could be paid less than men, who then, in some cases, took on much of the domestic labour. This led Friedrich Engels to comment all the way back in 1843 that we must admit that so total a reversal of the position of the sexes can have come to pass only because the sexes have been placed in a false position from the beginning. Yeah, that's right. In the 19th century, Engels was already talking about sexual difference and the gender binary being social constructs. So capitalism works on the basis of this fabrication that there are two sexes and each have certain characteristics. But it is just that, a fabrication, and that should be obvious. We know trans people exist, we know genderqueer people exist, we know intersex people exist. And we also know that gender non-conforming people are subject to an intense degree of oppression, from being shut out of jobs, being subject to poor and often hostile medical care, and careful monitoring of their bodies by both the state and corporations. And we can understand this hostility towards gender non-conforming people as motivated, at least in part, by the same capitalistic mechanism of organising labour around sex. It is designed to get people to act according to certain ideas of what it means to be a certain sex, and making sure those ideas work towards the capitalist pursuit of profit. This means that breaking with capitalism might mean doing away with gender roles and moving beyond this idea of sexual difference. The xenomorph poses a threat to capitalism precisely because it exposes this falsity of sexual difference. It takes the organs of sexual difference and overlays them, confuses them, makes them work in ways that do not conform to capitalist ideas of sex. From the vulviform formation of the egg the facehugger bursts from, to the fleshy folds of the facehugger's underside, and culminating in the slender frame of the xenomorph, the female aspects of the xenomorph are strongly presented, but equally, male aspects are present. The facehugger erupts from the egg with an ejaculatory force and penetrates Cain's mouth with a phallic object. And the xenomorph's head is made up of several overlapping phalluses that spend much of the film penetrating human bodies. However, what is most interesting about the xenomorph is not simply that it contains both feminine and masculine elements, but these elements themselves are confused. Eggs ejaculate and penises emerge from fleshy folds. In this way, the xenomorph appears as a metaphor for an undifferentiated series of sexual organs that violate the idea of the gender binary. So, Should we read the fact that the xenomorph is one of the main villains of the film as aliens saying that queerness is horrifying and wrong? I think that's a tad simplistic, and it ignores the possibilities created by the xenomorph. Instead, I want to argue that the xenomorph offers an opportunity for becoming, and a becoming that renders vivid the utter arbitrariness of sexual norms. This becoming is called a becoming queer, and it is an opportunity to transcend the boundaries of sexual difference. According to Deleuze and Guattari, becoming always presents the opportunity for undoing traditional modes of being and understanding oneself. They write, "No one can know where the line of flight will pass. Will it let itself get bogged down and fall back to normative modes of being? Or will it succumb to another danger, for example, turning into a line of abolition, annihilation, self-destruction? The risks are ever present." But ultimately, becoming is worthwhile to Deleuze and Guttari because it presents the possibility of living otherwise by transcending the bounds within which we are trapped. Becoming queer has been described by Verena, Adam and Conley as consisting of non-genealogical, monstrous becomings. A radical move that breaks down all oppositions imposed by state thought and its various representations, family, school, law or army. Queering produces becomings that go beyond normative couplings to invent new connections. In this view, queer becomes a verb, a becoming that experiments with new modes of being. It isn't something that ever really finishes or finds a place to rest within the capitalist mode of production, but rather constantly seeks to destabilize the institutions and binaries of capitalism, such as male or female and heterosexual or homosexual. Queering seeks to transcend these binaries, to find new modes of being outside of them. It is precisely for this purpose that the company wants to acquire the xenomorph. Deleuze and Guattari write that one of the functions of capitalism is to take abhorrent ideas or forms and rework them so they suit the purposes of capitalism. Buy this pack of Skittles and you're supporting gay rights. Buy this icon and you're supporting trans rights. Neither of these modes of activism actually fight against the systems that have oppressed queer people through the rigid maintenance of sexual difference. They merely make queerness something that can be profited from. It maintains capitalism. Becoming queer means going beyond these capitalistic structures into something new and potentially dangerous to capitalism. Ripley undergoes this becoming queer through a becoming xenomorph, but she has to fight to begin this becoming. Ash, who we have earlier established as a symbol of the company, attempts to kill Ripley by shoving a folded up magazine down her throat. The magazine seems to take on phallic properties, but it is not a becoming, it is a shutdown of her becoming queer, an attempt to return the phallus to its penetratory function. It is not until Ash is disposed of and the company rejected that Ripley is able to directly confront the xenomorph and begin a becoming queer. It is precisely this becoming queer that enables Ripley's survival, figured most clearly in the finale of the film, where Ripley uses the phallic harpoon to eject the xenomorph from the metallic womb of the escape shuttle. In other words, an ejaculating womb. This becoming xenomorph is also depicted as explicitly anti-corporate, linking Ripley's becoming queer to an anti-capitalism. For much of the first half of the film, Ripley is a stickler for procedure and rules.
You also forgot the Science Division's basic quarantine law.
No, that I didn't forget.
Oh, I see, you just broke it.
She is outraged when Ash lets Kane into the ship after the facehugger has attached itself to him, an action that violates the quarantine procedure we've previously discussed. Ripley abandons this mode of being when she realizes that the company has set the characters up, that it has violated its own quarantine procedure in order to ensure that the xenomorph is brought to them, even if it means the death of the crew. It is at this point that her becoming xenomorph enables Ripley to transcend the boundaries the company has set for her, that is, the series of strict procedures she and her crew are expected to follow. From there, she and the crew decide to abandon the ship.
We're gonna blow up the ship.
And kill the monster the company so desires. Through her becoming xenomorph, Ripley undergoes a line of flight that breaks down the understanding of what she can do that has been rigorously set up by the corporate procedures the company has handed down to her, giving her the tools to resist both the xenomorph and the company. The conditions thrust down on Ripley by the company that order what she can do, that are set up to enable a capitalist idea of what men and women should do, are precisely what she must reject to survive the threat posed by both the xenomorph and the company. Her survival is contingent on her becoming xenomorph. So let us state our concluding thesis. Alien is a film about survival. In this context, survival is posited as necessarily anti-corporate and anti-capitalist. One cannot survive if they exist within the terms set out by capitalism, but rather they must seek new modes of being that transcend the structures imposed on them by capitalism. In other words, Alien is a film about becoming other. Final report. So Alien turned out to be the first film in a franchise, and as a franchise, the Alien films have quite a tricky relationship to capitalism. The first film, as I've argued in this video, was pretty staunchly anti-capitalist and tied this anti-capitalism to an anti-heteronormativity. But on the other hand, Alien is also the product of a corporation, 20th Century Fox, and the sequels all take on quite different and arguably less radical approaches to the question of capitalism. Aliens, the second film in the franchise, certainly takes an anti-big business stance, but does so through Ripley entering into and finding strength in a heteronormative nuclear family unit. The nuclear family is a product of capitalism. The husband and wife both work, be it domestic work or otherwise, take on distinct roles and have to spend money to create the next generation that will themselves create their own nuclear family. In Aliens, Ripley forms a nuclear family unit with Hicks and Newt and must vanquish the dangerous, queer-coded alien queen who threatens this unity. Aliens is not a story of becoming, but a story of reinforcing capitalist norms of gender, sexuality, and living. So while at the level of film form, Aliens is a masterpiece in tension and action, its thematic work is far less interesting or radical than the first film. Alien 3, or Alien Cubed, returns to the more complicated political work of the first film, and I may do a video on it in the future, but it was subject to intense corporate interference that meant the theatrical release of the film was a disaster. As for Alien Resurrection and the others...
So, who do I have to fuck to get off this boat?
Yeah, we don't talk about those. So let's get back to the first film. We've learned a lot about Alien over the course of this video. We've learned how Alien conceptualizes class conflict. We've learnt how Alien conceptualizes corporate models of power, and we've learnt how Alien ties queerness to anti-capitalist action. I began this video by challenging the notion that Alien is a timeless film, and I hope you see how situating Alien in its historical context renders its radical content more clearly and shows how Alien is relevant today. When we say something isn't timeless, we pluck it out of the vacuum in which it was kept. It becomes timely, and its time could pass. So, several lifetimes ago, way back in June of this year, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said,
"One thing I think coronavirus crisis has already proved is that there really is such a thing as society."
This was in contradistinction to what Margaret Thatcher had said in the 1980s. There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look after themselves first. Thatcher's quote kind of became emblematic of the selfish cruelty of her political programme and the neoliberal project more generally. And the fact that Boris Johnson, the leader of the Conservative Party, the same party that Thatcher was once ruler of, was speaking in opposition to Thatcher, signalled to many that the neoliberal project might be over. Is it? Is it finally over? I doubt it. I mean, corporations still hold almost all the power. They can still buy elections, and worker surveillance is getting even worse. Working conditions are getting worse. The wage disparity between the richest and the poorest is the worst it's ever been. It doesn't seem over to me, but it does seem like something might be changing. hold that thought. There's one more thing I want to get to. Earlier in this video, I suggested Alien has a reasonably sophisticated understanding of the relationship between race and class. But it is notable that it does not extend this understanding much into its anti-capitalist conclusion with Ripley. Black activists from Angela Davis to Audre Lorde and even Martin Luther King have pointed out the connections between capitalism and racism, and they have fought hard against these institutions. Black people are at the centre of anti-capitalist struggles. Black people face state and corporate violence on a horrifying level, and it is imperative we listen and learn from them. At the time I am recording this, there is an uprising in America after the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. This uprising has taken on global dimensions. I urge you to do everything you can to help those on the ground, whether that be through donations or otherwise. I will put links to resources that you can use to help the protesters in the description.
Well, there's no single simple meaning of the term revolutionary. A revolutionary is a man or a woman who is a lot of things, but basically the revolutionary wants to change the nature of society in a way to promote a world where the needs and interests of the people are responded to. A revolutionary realizes, however, that in order to create a world where human beings can live and love and be healthy and create, you have to completely revolutionize the entire fabric of society. You have to overturn the economic structure where you have a few individuals who are in possession of the vast majority of the wealth in this country that's been produced by the majority of the people, and you have to destroy this political apparatus which, under the guise of revolutionary government, perpetrates the most incredible misery on the masses of people.